Good. So welcome. This is the Dharma Study Group. Tonight's topic is self-empathy, self-compassion on the path of self-study. In Sanskrit we call self-study svadhyaya. So we're going to sit in quiet for several minutes together. I'll ring this bell to start the quiet period, and then I'll also ring it to end the quiet period. In between the sound of the bell, you may hear some instruction from me that you're welcome to follow if it helps you to settle more into yourself. So the sound of the bell will go back to silence, and likewise the sounds that surround us will also inevitably dissolve back to silence. So while you sit, rest your hands where they're most comfortable. Close the eyes or look down, and invite the thoughts that have occupied your mind today to also dissolve back to silence. To support thoughts in dissolving back to silence, allow the listening to all the ambient sounds around you to be with a relatively relaxed ear. So you don't have to name or even know what the origin of sound is. Allow sound to remind you that there is a larger silence in which all sounds arise and to which they all dissolve. So in this way, as your thinking mind can attend to sound, regardless of whether we like or dislike the sound or have the impulse to name the sound, coax your thinking mind to use sound as a place to be present in the here and now, since sound is occurring and the big space in which sound exists is also available. Lift the needle from the record player of your habitual thought and let sound be a relief for now. But for any moment, you can coax your attention from thought to sound and the space in which sound exists. I like to call that a mindfulness victory. For those few moments, we are not so caught in our own hamster wheel mind. You can become present to the larger spell of life that is occurring, that is always ongoingly occurring. Being offered the opportunity to notice sound and the space in which sound is moving also gives you the opportunity to notice how compulsive your own thoughts are tonight, like how habitual, how magnetically drawn to thought are you, or how willing are you to suspend thought and listen. Listen to the aliveness of the present moment. When we listen to sound and the big space in which sound is moving, we also become aware of the larger circle of humanity. Sometimes I like to refer to that as the countless seen and unseen others who are also experiencing the human condition. With a sense of appreciation for this common humanity, this shared experience, now bring your awareness down into where the air in this room makes contact with the skin of your body. Be more intimately connected to those sensations in any place that you're able to feel them, whether that's subtle or obvious, whether it has nuance or seems very dynamic. And as you notice the air making contact with the skin of your body, you may interpret a message I like to offer with this meditation, that life is coming to meet you. You are a part of this shared humanity, and in fact, life comes to meet you in every moment. So coax your mind back to noticing the air against the skin of the body. Even if you have to coax your thinking mind out of habit and into this sensory event every half second, you can still call that a mindfulness victory. So life is coming to meet you. Don't busy or worry the mind. Notice the intimate experience of the air against your skin. However subtle or dynamic you might experience that. You can bring the hands together in Anjali Mudra, please. And with your exhale, you may bow your head to your heart. And release both hands. You may open the eyes if you'd like to do so. So the topic tonight is self-empathy, self-compassion on the path of self-study. And it's really helpful for me to hear from you why you're compelled to be here, or what might be stirring in the territory of self-empathy or self-compassion. And as I often say, it's easier for me to hear what you have to say if you say it out loud. I brought a couple quotes on self-empathy, so I'm going to read those and then I'll give you a few moments to collect your thoughts so you can tell me why you're here. So, some of them are funnier than others. This one is from Carly Fiorina. She says, "Look, I'm a cancer survivor, all right? So I have great personal empathy for people who have pre-existing conditions and can't get insurance." This is very specific. So she has an experience and she has empathy for others who have that same experience. And Barack Obama is also quoted here. Let me see if I can find his. He said, "We need somebody who's got the heart, the empathy, to recognize what it's like to be a young teenage mom, the empathy to understand what it's like to be a poor or African American or gay or disabled or old person. And that's the criterion by which I'll be selecting my judges." Should I read that again? "We need somebody who's got the heart, the empathy, to recognize what it's like to be a young teenage mom, the empathy to understand what it's like to be poor or African American or gay or disabled or old. And that's the criterion by which I'll be selecting my judges." So on that note, I'd be curious how you've selected your judge. That means your inner judge. What was the criteria? And also, why are you here this evening? How could I help?
Okay.
Yes.
I'm fortunate enough to be here. this week in the teacher training, so I'm soaking in all I can of teachings with you. And in my world outside of being here, there's a lot of challenge, a lot of arenas where I'm reaching into new parts of myself that feel really uncomfortable and are difficult. I understand they're good places that I'm reaching into, but they're hard, and it feels unrelenting at times. So I'd like to, I think that if I wasn't so hard on myself about how I'm responding, that it would be easier. It would be an easier, it wouldn't be so unrelenting. I'd have a better attitude toward it, and I would move more smoothly through it, all the challenges. I believe that. And so I'm always looking for tools and ways to connect with how I can do that. And then the second part is just as a teacher, as a yoga teacher, I'd like to have the capacity to have more compassion and connection with all different kinds of students, and learn how to be in that place as a teacher more.
Yeah, so interesting, as you were saying, you could judge yourself less, or the way you respond to yourself in current circumstance. So I am curious, by what criteria did you choose your judge? I mean, your inner judge. Do you have any sense of that?
I look out. I look outward and compare.
Yes.
And I've always done that, and I do less of it now, thank God, because I did a ton of it when I was younger.
Yeah.
And I was really, I was paralyzed by that. And there's still remnants of that that obviously have enough of a grip that I have a lot more to work on.
Yeah. Yes.
That comparison.
Yeah.
Part of myself.
I understand. Yeah. Good. Thank you. And for others, how can I help, and why are you here? And do you have any sense of how you chose your inner judge?
I think kind of going off of what you were saying too, I'm in a place right now where I'm putting myself in a bunch of different opportunities, and like in there I know I can do it, but then there's always my judge, who I'm trying to get a better understanding of why this judge thinks I can't do it, and or has its doubts about it. So I'm curious to learn more about like catching those times when the judge might be making like foul calls.
Yes. Yeah. Very good. Like the umpire at the baseball game. When is he making a foul call?
Yeah.
And the people in the stands get angry, right? No, that's not the right call. Okay. Very good. Thank you. Somebody else?
I can speak a bit. I mean, I definitely recognize that my inner judge has multiple origins. And I guess I'll speak about one that I do find bothersome. It's definitely like the social conditioning that we have like growing up here. So I mean, I strongly identify as a feminist. My inner judge is not a feminist, and so it's strange hearing those messages. I'm like, that's not me. That's not what I believe. But they come so readily.
Yes. You internalize something to be the voice of that inner judge, but it doesn't line up with your values.
No.
Yes. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes.
It's such a big question that I'm sitting here trying to think how to answer, and I think that there's so many different approaches and levels, and stages, and so I can just maybe hint at a few for now. In yoga training, which I'm in with Annie, Sarah Joy, we just recently finished a module on mindfulness, and in that there were so many thoughts and ideas and concepts that I feel are so vital to being present and being at peace, and being able to live a life, the kind of life that I want to live, that I know is possible, that I want to be possible for other people. And as a teacher, I think that self-study is really everything. I mean, as a human being, self-study is everything. And I think that, the life is a challenge, and it's a mystery, and the first noble truth is life is suffering, and to be able to balance things is really, I think, what the human condition and the human experience is. And so I want to know as much as possible. And empathy and compassion are the things the challenges that are so hard, especially, living a life of as we all have our wounds and our experiences, our losses, and I think that in order to be an effective teacher and to live a life, a peaceful, harmonious, balanced life, that this is all there is. So
Thank
that's
you.
sort of a little bit.
That was
how I
very well
feel.
said. And it is a big topic, as you said, by starting. It's a big topic. Yeah. And I'll share a few things that you have heard in your training, so you get it reinforced. You get to have some review. One of the questions I have for us is, would it be possible to look at the inner judge and have empathy for him or her? To understand, what does the inner judge think its responsibilities are? And why is it doing them? And why does it think it needs to have that voice tone to speak to us? So if you were to characterize the inner judge, if you were to personify it, even temporarily, as an outside character, what might you think it thinks its responsibilities are? My own experience of human condition and human nature, my own experience of that inner judge, is that it perceives that one of its responsibilities is to keep you safe. Another would be to shape you so that you socially experience some sort of harmony or acceptance or belonging. Another is to help motivate you to grow. So if your inner judge actually thought that those were its responsibilities, that seems rather kind. To keep you safe, to help promote social experiences of belonging, and to help you to grow into who you're meant to be. The challenge is that the inner judge is also like the inner dictator and the inner censor, meaning censor like when they censor news. I don't mean censor like sensory experience of the body. So the inner judge also has become the inner dictator, the inner censor, the inner taskmaster, and the inner condemner. So rather than experiencing belonging, we experience isolation and fear. Now, if the inner judge actually holds as its responsibilities to help keep you safe, to cultivate experiences in you that lead to social belonging, and to help you motivate yourself to grow, if it actually thinks those are its responsibilities, somewhere it went awry in getting its voice tone and language culture established, because as a dictator, condemner, or condescender, it's not actually helping you, it's harming you. Do you understand what I mean by that? So each of us internalized somewhere the inner judge with the voice tone and the language culture that isn't that helpful right now. But if our inner judge, as it were intending to help, we might actually appreciate that those three responsibilities belong somewhere in our psyche. I want to explain a little bit about the brain and human development because I think it puts into context why we crave social belonging and what it's about. And also we can have a sense of that thing that is human in each of us. So a couple of concepts to lay on the table. One is that when you're born, and you've heard this just yesterday, you're born with only the right hemisphere functioning. And one of the things I'm recently fascinated by repeatedly and find very humorous is that if we were to be born with a fully functioning brain, we'd have to have enormous heads, and the mother couldn't give birth to that size head. So we are born at a stage when the brain isn't fully developed yet, and neither are the skull bones formed completely. They're still mobile. Therefore, the mother can give birth to the offspring. But it's the most vulnerable offspring on the planet for the longest period of time. And what it's most vulnerable to is being shunned, neglected, abandoned, rejected. So all along, we have the social brain, as we call it. And if you're born with a primal fear of being shunned, neglected, abandoned, or rejected, that primal fear doesn't leave you when your brain finishes developing. Most of our conditioning is happening in the first decades of life when the brain is the most porous, soaking in all the information and conditioning around us. And the brain is the most likely to hold memory because it's shaping itself. So while that's occurring, you have this most vulnerable, most porous, most fragile experience of your brain and of you. And after those couple decades are over, you get to be this sort of like fully formed human being who can vote and drink alcohol and drive a car. Like you're 16 to 25 years old. Your brain, they say, is fully done developing, quote unquote developing, in your early to mid 20s. That's a long time to develop a brain, to develop a person. And if you think about how much we go through in those first decades of life, it's extraordinary that we come through it as well as we do. And of course, by the time we realize that we're distressed, we have the implicit memory of we are terrified of being shunned, abandoned, neglected, or rejected. We have the explicit memory, that is a time-space memory of what happened with us in our development. And we house those things in parts of our brain that are still trying to protect and shape us. So, for example, you have this organ in your brain, this section of the brain called the amygdala, and its job is to prepare you to be able to respond to fear or to threat. You have other organs in there too, like the hippocampus is holding some memories for you to help you figure out how to navigate life. But a lot of the memory making that we've done before we realize we're doing it, we were so young in our brain development that our perspective is, first 6 to 7 years of life, our perspective is it's all about us. It has to be. That's the level that the brain can function at. So what's happening around us we perceive to be about us. Then between 7 and 14 you have the self-other capacity, 7 to 12. And then 12, 14 into adolescence you have this explosion of brain function that you can't organize or make cohesive because the brain parts aren't growing at all the same rate to cause you to think clearly. So were you more emotional as an adolescent than you are now? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sure.
Well, how far out of adolescence are you, honey?
1 year.
You're doing such a great job with your life, really, because you're already here in this discussion. Yes, and adolescence is a very close memory for you. Yes. But when our brains were adolescent brains, they go through so much. It's really, really incredible. So I was saying in the last Dharma study group that at your current biological age, to look back on who you were when you made certain decisions that created certain behavior patterns, including thought patterns, that include today's causes of suffering in your own life. When you look back on the way that you formed those behaviors, thoughts, and actions, if you could look at it from the age you were, when you were creating those samskars, as we call them in yoga, you would have so much more tenderness for yourself about how you formed yourself and your worldview. The challenge is that today's brain has a more capable function, so you can look at a thing 360, but when you were 5 you couldn't look 360. You didn't actually have that capacity when you were 5 years old. You didn't have it when you were 6 either, nor when you were 2. So we look back and we say, why am I still doing this thing? This behavior I've been doing for such a long time, why am I still doing it? Because you picked it up at a time when it was a helpful strategy and you weren't able to outgrow it yet. It's okay. You didn't outgrow it yet. The optimal word in the sentence is yet. And that includes the way that you see yourself, the way your inner judge works, the behaviors and strategies you have for self-soothing. All of it. It's in there. Do you have questions about that so far? Okay, so let's hypothesize for a moment that when you're born, because your right hemisphere is fully functioning, and you have about 2 years of time where that's your orientation, and the right hemisphere has one of its primal jobs is to scan the world for safety and connection or threat and danger. So if your brain learns to scan, and let's say you learn to scan because your environment was more or less chaotic or more or less stable, you learn to scan based on the environment you were growing that ability in. So where you are on that spectrum, you're going to create a brain that has a particular pattern for scanning. So more chaos, the brain will scan more towards fear and threat. More stability, the brain scans more for connection and harmony. It actually anticipates that. And the other brain anticipates more stress and chaos, more threat and danger. So if your brain's been accustomed to that, and its job is to scan to make sure that you're safe and okay in the world, when your left hemisphere comes on board, it starts explaining why you're in danger or why you experience stability. When it starts explaining why you're in danger, it has to be about you. Because when you're 2 or 3 years old, you can't make it about anybody else. You don't have the capacity. When your brain scans for safety and connection, it's also about you. So from that lens, you're producing the world as you see it and experience it. And the world is responding to you. So then we shape ourselves to avoid being abandoned, neglected, rejected, shunned, or annihilated. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? So depending on the environment your brain is growing in, you're going to shape it to secure your survival. You could look back on that at a later stage in life and say, oh, I was betraying myself. Because I really wanted to be a happy-go-lucky kid, but I was forming myself to be a stable, studious kid. Or I really wanted to be a studious child, but I was forming myself to be less threatening to my parents or my caregivers, so I just wasn't as smart as I actually meant to be. You were forming something so that you could secure your survival. So to look back on it and say, oh, I was betraying myself, is actually faulty thinking. It's not kind of unfair to say that to yourself from today's brain age, looking back at that brain age. Do you understand why that's unfair? And when people go to criminal court in this country, are they treated fairly?
No.
Not generally. No. So when you cross-examine yourself, is it likely that your inner judge is doing that fairly? Also, let me ask you if your inner judge wants the whole story. The inner judge already has an idea that you did something wrong or bad, or that you're flawed or broken in some way. There's this peculiar part of human development that I was talking to Annie and Camille about yesterday that I just want to put on the table too, because I think it helps so much to understand why the brain is so vulnerable to shame or rejection in this very specific manner. And those of you who have young kids currently or who have had young kids, you understand very directly. So it's seemingly paradoxically that at about 2 years old, when the left hemisphere starts to come on board and children get a sense of self, they also become capable of moving faster away from the caregiver. They can walk. They can crawl faster, they can walk, they can even run a little bit. And often you'll see the young being running about and then looking back over the shoulder to check that they're being chased or that it's okay to go that far. And they might even run back towards the caregiver, and they're sort of testing this distance that they can tolerate, and that so can the caregiver tolerate it. Well, while that's happening, while that extra mobility is happening, the caregiver is concerned about the safety of the small being in this big chaotic world. So the small being doesn't have a sense of how big or chaotic the world is, so she or he is running about, and the caregiver's like, no! And the child starts to hear the big word, no! Often for the first time. And in a voice tone that experiences fear. Like, no, don't cross the street without me. No, I said yesterday, don't put your face in the dog's face, in case the dog doesn't like kids. Or no, don't touch the hot wood stove. So you're trying to preserve the child's survival as the caregiver, right? And yet the child experiences for that moment in this like vulnerable, innocent 2-year-old thing that, oh God, the world just got interrupted. My life just collapsed for a moment. And you can see the shrinking of the child in response to that voice tone. It's not to say it's good or bad parenting. It's kind of I was saying, like a paradox of our development, that at that age when you get to be mobile and have agency, you also terrify your parents, who are more or less uneasy and exhausted, because they're they're parents of young humans, so they're overwhelmed and tired. And while that's all happening, your brain is laying in these tracks about who you are and how shunnable you are. And that's the age at which, between 1 and 2 years old, we get to experience shame for the first time. And depending on the environment that we're exposed to that in, we're going to have higher or lesser degrees of shame as our orientation. And I suspect that one of the main priorities of your inner judge is to protect you from the shame of others, even so far as it will go to preferring the shame that you enact on yourself, rather than somebody else's. Do you understand what I mean by that? Have you experienced that your personal dose of shame to yourself is a bit easier to tolerate than somebody else shaming you? It's not a comfortable state, it's not desirable, but we tend to tolerate our own shame station. And we may even preempt it to activate it before somebody else can shame us. It's a defense mechanism. You understand that, Amy Jo?
Just what you're saying, I just keep thinking about like my sister and I, who have like the same genetics and grew up in like essentially the same environment. We have like nothing in common with our personalities, and even when we were like babies, we like acted completely opposite of each other.
What's your age difference?
3 years.
That's actually pretty big.
Yeah.
Who was born first?
My sister.
Mm-hmm. So by the time you were born, your family household had to say no a lot because your 3-year-old sister was doing whatever it was doing. Just a hypothesis. Yeah.
Maybe.
Mm-hmm. My identical twin sister and I are 8 minutes apart. We aren't that identical when it comes to who we are in our personalities. We are in our hand gestures, in our eyes, our voice tone, and our speech mannerisms. Except that she teaches music to middle schoolers, the band at the Ashland Middle School, and I teach yoga to grown-ups. So as I was teaching you guys, I have a lot more voice modulation and, like down-regulate and soothe the environment. My sister has to go, okay, everybody, and like get the middle schoolers to pay attention. So there are differences, but 8 minutes is far fewer time between our 2 births than 3 years. And we're still different creatures also. Everyone's born with a temperament and a constitution. And even if you have similar genetic codes, you may not have similar constitution. You experience that as a mom too, right? They have very different constitutions. How many years between them?
4.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. One very acclimated to the world, confident, works with the world, right? And the other one is completely at odds with the world.
Mm-hmm.
Just bumps up against the world. It's just
Yeah. So the places that I'd like to shine light on for self-empathy include the inner judge, which I hypothesize is clamoring a bit for us to have empathy for her or him, for how hard she or he is working to keep us safe in the world. And also empathy for the internalized voice that's trying to protect us by shaming us before somebody else can. What do you think about those 2 concepts?
They resonate a lot with me, and I had an intention tonight to just be a listener, but I'm going to share anyway. My father is a judge.
Oh, really?
And I have a 2, almost 3-year-old son.
How ironic.
It's very similar to my father and my brother in temperament and
Mm.
behavior. He's my younger son. My father is a fair judge. He started a drug court in his small community, and he's doing some phenomenal work, and he has a lot of compassion for the people that he sees in his court. And it's not always met with support from
Mm-hmm.
the legal community where he lives, but I'm really proud of his work.
Yeah.
But I think, those early years, he wasn't this self-actualized, confident person. He was in law school
Mm-hmm.
and stressed out. And
Mhm.
so I'm reflecting on that and the formation of my own inner judge.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons I'm here tonight is because I want to get to a place where I have love for myself so that I can hold the space for my kids
Mhm.
and allow my 2-year-old to explore the world that he wants to explore
Mhm.
and find out how things work and not hear, no, it's gonna, there's so much anxiety that is my response to his behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, we just been
Mhm.
talking about everything. That's,
Yeah. And I think you hinted at this, but I'll frame it that some of your anxiety is intergenerational. It isn't just your own. It's human nature, but it's also intergenerational. Yeah. And what is the risk if we were to just shine love towards ourselves?
We'd be like viewed as being narcissistic or
Mhm.
I don't know, egotistic.
Mm-hmm.
someone will think that I don't know all the things I should be ashamed of already.
Mhm. Mm-hmm. There is a primal risk in radical acceptance and self-love. The risk, just speaking as a primitive organism, the risk is you'll forget to scan the environment for danger.
I feel like too, it's like not feeling like you'll fit in because it's so like common for people to be critical like of themselves outwardly too.
Mhm.
Say like, oh, I hate this about myself or something.
Yeah.
And if you're not doing it, then it feels like, or you don't think that way.
Yes.
Like you don't fit in.
And the fear of not fitting in is also the fear of not surviving. Because you can't tolerate, the primitive you can't tolerate being shunned, abandoned, rejected, or neglected. Now, the grown-up you doesn't want to tolerate standing out because you might get rejected. You might experience isolation in that. I was just teaching at Kripalu over the weekend. It was a mother-daughter weekend of yoga, and I asked them to do this really specific exercise on appreciating oneself. We'll do a little work on it tonight. And one of the 13-year-olds who was there, she said, well, that doesn't feel like what we ought to be doing because I think it's really selfish if I appreciate myself. If I appreciate myself for this thing, well, why would I do it? She said, it's just very selfish. And I asked her to hypothesize, with different language than I'm using right now, like, what if when she appreciates something about herself, it gives her mother a chance to celebrate her? And the 13-year-old had like a Zen koan moment, like a brain spasm. My mother might appreciate me, she said.
That's a rare moment for a teenager.
Well, and her mother was in the workshop with her. So when they actually did the exercise, it was very transformational for them to realize that everybody was asked to share a specific appreciation about themselves from the last 2 hours. Not like a life appreciation, but from the last 2 hours of our time together that we had been there. So those specific 2 hours. And when the daughter did share what she was sharing with the mother realized, I never would have thought of that. I would not have thought to appreciate that thing about you that you're so appreciating about yourself. And so she got to learn something about her daughter and celebrate that with her. And the daughter felt actually overwhelmed to have that thing be seen and acknowledged. In a way that was tender, not overwhelmed, like upset, but overwhelmed, tender. But there's that primal risk. If you practice radical acceptance and self-love, you might forget to scan for danger. Now, you're not actually in danger at the moment, so it's a good time to practice radical acceptance and self-love. I mean, as I look at you, you look like you've recently, at least in the last few days, you've had food, shelter, and clothing, and some water, and maybe some companionship. And you haven't had frostbite in the last few days. You haven't been on the street overnight in the last few days. So you're relatively in this environment, relatively safe, and you've been, we call this resourced. Your resources have been taken care of. So it's a good time to practice not the brain that is scanning for danger, but the other part of our brain that can radically relax and invite us into self-love and acceptance, including empathy towards the inner judge and a tender understanding about why we internalized the shame of others as our own voice. Any questions? Okay, so I'm going to ask you to do a little exercise with yourself, and that means if you're not comfortable sitting as you are right now, shake out the legs or the arms, make a transition, and then come back to a comfortable seat, whatever it might be. You could also lie down if you prefer that. If you don't need to lie down, please stay upright, because once one person lies down, then another, and then another, and then I'm the only one sitting up. So once you get the fidgets a little bit worked out and you have circulation in the ankles and knees again, then, and you can choose to sit on a chair or a Swiss ball if you prefer that, that's okay too. Then you can rest your hands in your lap and let your eyes close or choose to look down so you can quiet your eyes. There is an aspect of the brain that has to scan for danger, but there are also aspects of the brain that can experience empathy and deep relaxation. And one way to experience that bathing in empathy is to know that we've been seen without being rejected, that we've been heard and understood without being shunned, and that we experience a sense of belonging that's unconditional. To cultivate that brain state, which includes the brain as an organ and the mind as a function, the heart as a capacity, bring your awareness now to where your body makes contact with the ground beneath you. And know that contact in a really deliberate way, like the texture of the yoga mat, the blanket, the floor. Offer to your thinking mind this place to rest and to resist the urge to scan for danger. So you notice the ankles or the hips or any other body part that makes contact with the ground. And as your thinking mind rests on that place of connection, now we'll do Ujjayi breathing for about 2 or 3 minutes. I'd like you to make the exhale longer than the inhale so as to further settle down your brain and to quiet your mind. So place the tip of the tongue behind the top 2 teeth and make a hollow space in the back of the throat, similar to when you're yawning. And as you cultivate the Ujjayi sound, listen to it with your full attention, without judging or evaluating the breath listen for the purpose of soothing your nervous system and your brain. Do your best to relax any unnecessary tension in the belly or the face, so your Ujjayi breath is your primary focus. And take 3 more breath cycles, and at the end of the 3rd Ujjayi exhale, relax your breathing completely. At the end of that exhale, as you release the breath, maintain a relaxed face and imagine a space in the center of your heart into which you can invite aspects of yourself, beginning with the most innocent aspect of who you are. So bring into your heart your innocence, your native innocence. I'd like you to visualize that innocence in you as an infant and a toddler, as a grade schooler, and as a teenager. And stay with the innocence, so the other aspects of who each of us is we can also work with, but stay with the innocence right now. And a young adult. And depending on your life stage, bring to heart the innocence in you in your 20s, in your 30s. And step by step to today's current biological age. And towards the life stream of your own innocence, extend warmth and kindness and understanding. Extend warmth and kindness and understanding. You don't need an explanation for anything to come to understanding. Towards that in you which is innocent and has been from the moment you were conceived, and extend warmth and kindness and understanding. Release any urge to resist or compromise your experience right now. You can visualize yourself making a gentle namaste to that aspect of you that is innocent and has been all along. And then I'd like you to bring to heart the aspect of you that has been earnest. Earnest in your efforts, earnest in your adventures and your trials and tribulations, and earnest in your growth, even in your setbacks, even in the leaps forward. And starting again from when you were an infant and there was instinct that was earnest. And the earnestness of you as a toddler, following instinct, and also following your own temperament and who you're meant to be. And the earnestness of you as a grade schooler is finding your way in the chaotic world. And the earnestness of you as a middle schooler or a teenager. The earnestness in all the trials and tribulations, all the life events, into your young adulthood. And towards the life stream of earnestness in you through your 20s, your 30s, towards today's biological age. And really see it as a wholesome earnestness, the effort each of us has made to stay socially connected and to follow our temperament and our constitution. Towards that stream in you that is earnest, extend again warmth, kindness, understanding. And now call to mind the aspect of you that expresses vulnerability and that has been vulnerable since the moment of your conception. And bring to heart the vulnerability of yourself as an infant. And as a toddler. And as a grade school child. And through middle school, that vulnerability that increases in middle school, that increases when you become a teenager with a rapidly growing and somewhat chaotic brain. And bring to mind the vulnerability you experienced in your time as a young adult. And from there, based on today's age, we go through the 20s, 30s. And towards that vulnerable aspect of yourself, extend warmth and kindness and understanding. And I'd like you now to call to mind a specific vulnerability from today. A specific vulnerability you experienced about yourself today. And as you bring that vulnerability into your heart, look now through the lens of the human condition. That lens tells you you are not alone experiencing this kind of vulnerability. Notice what happens to your physiological, respiratory, and mental experience when you hear. The lens of human conditioning tells you you are not alone in experiencing that vulnerability of today. And then acknowledge yourself for the effort of the last 10 or minutes or so. And when you feel ready to do so, you may open your eyes and reconnect to the room. So any observations or questions are welcome. Reflections are welcome. Can you make that 1 degree less so we'll have some air moving in the room? Mm-hmm. Thanks. So questions or reflections? Okay, if there's no questions or reflections right now, that means we move to the risky part. If you have a question or a reflection, now's the time to use it to postpone the risky part.
So last night I had the opportunity to do this color therapy with it's called like Arasoma. The woman I work for does it, and so she gave me a free consultation. It's really cool. Pick all these colors and things, and one of the big things that came up was vulnerability. And so I've been like trying to wrap my head around it all day. So it's, funny now that that's what we're talking about. And so I don't know, I guess it's like I could like feel vulnerability like really well as far as like thinking about myself when I was like younger, and just being like putting myself out, because you're just,
you're innocent and earnest, right?
Yeah.
A bit naive and, all of that.
Yeah, and like so dependent on your parents and people around you to take care of you, and you're just, completely
But somehow I suspect you're about to say your expectations have changed now that you're an adult.
Now it's like, I don't know. It's like I have trouble thinking about when I like vulnerable places now. Like I've learned to like kind of guard myself so much so that I'm not vulnerable. So it's, I don't know, it's just a thing.
Yet at the moment you have a little bit of vulnerability right now.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's good.
Where do you feel that in your body when you recognize it?
Right here.
Yeah. It's said by an author I like quite a bit. He said, vulnerability is the medium of intimacy. And even between us and us, that intimacy is forged through vulnerability and love and kindness, self-respect. But vulnerability is the medium in which we experience intimacy with ourselves or with others. So to guard ourselves or protect against that vulnerability is also to guard against intimacy, which I suspect isn't your intention when you guard. The intention is probably to protect something, yet we don't realize what the loss is also going to be. The part of the brain that scans for danger is looking for safety and gain, not loss. It thinks, what am I going to gain if I guard myself? Oh, well, I'll gain safety and security. And yet the other aspect of us that's interested in growth and becoming who we're meant to be, it wants to tolerate the loss so we can grow. Do you understand what I mean by that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We actually have to experience loss to grow, so we might as well get used to it. Yeah. Loss is one of the ways that we remember that we're vulnerable too as humans. Like, you might see this in children when you're working with them, and Amy Jo sees it in her young children now. That when, at a certain age, when a child doesn't get its way or it loses something, the whole world collapses. It's a significant loss. We don't have that same sense of loss now on a daily basis because our brains are more stable than when they were 3. But also because we push off to the margins what we're losing so we can keep going. Whatever the task at hand seems to be now that we're grown-ups, we're going to have these lives that we have responsibility for. But those perceived small losses actually accumulate into a big loss. Do you understand what I mean by that? Mm-hmm. So vulnerability is one of the doorways that lets you re-experience loss to use it for growth, not for devastation. Yeah, so the risky part I was going to say, if you have given us a nice entry into, thank you, is if anybody were able to call to mind a specific vulnerability from today, and if you did, you can say in a moment what it might have been, but if you were to look at that specific vulnerability thing as a cluster of some sort that you could quietly pull apart, like the Russian eggs. Do you know what I'm speaking of when I say the Russian eggs? Oh, dolls, yeah. They're called dolls. Do they look like eggs?
They're like babushka
Okay.
dolls or something.
Yeah, what is it called?
Babushka.
Babushka dolls?
Nesting dolls.
Yeah,
Oh,
Russian
nesting dolls, yeah, like that. So if you're able to pull that vulnerability apart like this today, in the end, we might realize that the instinct to guard against that vulnerability is an empty instinct, because it won't lead to much. It won't lead to pain and suffering, in fact. So if you had that vulnerable event and you could pull it apart, one layer, one doll at a time, the last doll, there's nothing there, is that right?
It's just a little solid little doll.
Mm. like pea size?
Yeah.
Like that? Yeah, so then maybe the vulnerability becomes manageable because it's pea size, like that. So I'll tell you about a specific vulnerability. I couldn't register one from today because I'm also teaching, so it's not the same orientation for me when I'm teaching as when I'm studenting. But I was teaching at Kripalu over the weekend, and I met 40 people for the first time, all mothers and daughters coming away for a weekend to reunite or reconnect or reinfuse a relationship that was on some spectrum harmonious or broken. So, and it's a mother-daughter weekend, so that's a pretty powerful relationship. And I had 40 mothers and daughters that I had not met between the ages of 13 and 75. And of course, there's a sea of facial expressions as I'm talking with them. And as I talk as comfortably with you now about material like the brain and yoga and so on, I'm giving them the same information. And it's Friday night. The class goes on Friday from 7:30 to 9, but I was going late until 9:15 because I was still engaged with them. And I saw they were yawning. And the teenagers were wanting to nod off. And the tired mothers were like, and then other mothers were like, tell us more about that. Really engaged, really wanting more information. So I had this split in the audience of people who drove a long way to come to Kripalu. And I asked them before I started talking, how busy was your life before you left home on a scale of 1 to 10? They said 12, 14, 11. Nobody said 2, 3. So I had really exhausted brains in the room with very tired bodies and an array of interest and capacity, different ages and life experiences. And the room was sort of split on the first night in their interest level. At the end of that discussion, 2 people stayed later who they had come from a specific family dynamic that they're working with right now. And they said, oh, so helpful to have this brain information. We really like it. One of them was 18. She said, I wish I'd studied this in school. And so really enthusiastic. But when I went to bed, I still had the other faces in my mind. And the faces that I most remember were the ones that were like, I had to sit up on a little platform so 40 people could see me when I'm sitting on the floor, because otherwise I can't see them all. So like that, like looking at their mom, like, well. The next morning, everybody was very enthusiastic about what they had heard the night before and willing to engage in discussion. Maybe 2 or 3 were less interested than the others, but they were very enthusiastic. But my read on the event was facial expressions, and your amygdala will scan the environment for danger or connection, for threat or safety, and I perceived they don't like me. And when I went to bed that night, the other function in your brain is called the negativity bias. So it's already programmed into you to consider the negativity of a circumstance so that you can plan your survival. So did I remember the sea of faces that were really enthusiastic and the 2 people who spoke to me at the end of the night? Well, I remembered them. But what did my body register? The vulnerability of being on stage talking about this really provocative material to 40 people I'd never met. And to help myself pull apart the Russian dolls, I looked at, from my own perspective about me, let me say they were tired, they had traveled, they have busy lives, they're getting away, they have a complicated mother-daughter relationship. All of that is external and important. But internally, I had to say, wow, I traveled a long way to be here. I also am a little bit tired. I'm sharing vulnerable information. My own mother-daughter relationship isn't 100% swell. I'm teaching and exposing myself to other people's responses to these teachings. I love my work, and sometimes I'm not as articulate as other times. And I went through this process of sort of peeling apart the Russian dolls and realizing, oh, actually, I just feel really vulnerable and tired right now. And so I went through this meditation process with myself. Like, there's this innocence and earnestness and vulnerability, and it's a part of my human condition. And then I was able to rest in the human condition and fall asleep without judgment of myself. You understand? This is methodical in a way. I'm telling you this story because it puts context into my experience. And you might perceive me as a teacher who teaches all the time and she doesn't worry about it and doesn't feel ever incompetent or vulnerable. But I do. It's part of the thing about, as Carolyn said, if we praise ourselves, we might stand out a little bit. Well, when you're teaching, you're standing out. It's not about you, but it also is about you when you're teaching. It's coming through you. And I share my life events with people when I'm teaching about the brain and yoga. So there's an element of it also being about putting ourselves out in the space that connection can happen and risking that. So I would be curious if anybody had an experience that you'd be willing to take a risk with and tell us of today's specific vulnerability and how we might help you take the Russian dolls apart until you can rest in the realization that the innocence, earnestness, and vulnerability connects you to your humanity and is not a threat to your survival. Again, it's helpful if you're willing to say your vulnerable experience of today out loud. You'll be offering a gift to the class.
I have one, sort of, and from dance class, which is always kind of a vulnerable thing.
Yeah.
I was in ballet, and I was sort of like in the middle of the bar when we were starting, and then my teacher was like, move in front of like such and such, so I was in the front, so like I guess people can watch me, because this other girl was like, she hadn't been doing ballet in a while, and she was back, and she was like having a hard time and was like in tears.
Aww.
And yeah, it was interesting to watch. And then we were doing a really hard exercise, and I kept messing it up, and I felt bad.
Mm-hmm.
Partially because like I was messing it up, and partially because like I know other people were like watching me.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. And I think I have that a lot too. Also now because I'm like helping teach a class, and so if like my teacher has me demonstrate something and I mess it up, then I feel like I'm not a very good teacher.
Uh-huh.
But then I did sort of like step back from it, and I realized that it wasn't actually just me. Like it was just a really hard exercise,
Uh-huh.
and like other people were struggling with it, not just because of me.
Uh-huh. So how did you go from, you can change that again, thank you. How did you go from the secondary chatter opportunity that is the inner critic and the shame monster, as I call it? I'll say that more slowly. How did you go from the secondary chatter opportunity, right, the opportunity for the secondary chatter to come up about the event and use the inner critic and shame? How did you transition from that opportunity to saying, oh, it was a hard exercise actually, and I don't have to condemn myself for this? How'd you make the transition?
I don't know. I think it just like realized that it was hard to like keep going on like in the class with that like state of mind, and so I had to like find a way to change it.
Uh-huh. Yes. That's really successful for you, Caroline. It's a difficult thing to make that choice at the fork in the road between the opportunity right here to keep condemning myself, because what you just described is that people are watching you, so you're exposed. Exposure is a great way to bring up shame and vulnerability, the unskillful part of vulnerability that leads to condemning oneself. So she's exposed, the teacher's relying on her. You're dancing, which you've done before, somebody else is in tears. Ballet isn't always 100% unconditional love and regard from the teacher. I mean, as people have told me about their ballet experiences. So there you are in this ripe environment to actually have a meltdown, but you didn't choose the meltdown, you chose wise action. It would be really helpful for you to know how you can make that choice in that moment, because you'll need that choice making again. So I'm going to ask a couple questions. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Were you particularly more well rested, or was your blood sugar more balanced than on other days?
I was fairly well rested. I don't know, otherwise pretty much the same.
Mm-hmm. Have you known this teacher for some time?
Like 3 years.
Do you have a sense of her positive regard for you?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And you trust that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the other students in the room are more or less familiar to you or not?
I know pretty much all of them pretty well.
Mm-hmm. And you have a sense of their positive regard for you?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So all of that I'm asking because you're physiologically more or less vulnerable day to day, depending on how you take care of yourself. And then when you're in a circumstance where you can trust the positive regard is there, it's easier to rally yourself to say, I don't have to have a vulnerable moment become a shame meltdown. I can have it become a moment where I build my trust in myself, not where I derail it. Because we're social creatures looking for safety and belonging. So you had enough going on in that environment, and you had enough internally to make that choice at the fork in the road. And I think that's a big celebration. So when you go to sleep tonight, when you lie down in your bed, this is what I'll recommend to you. That you say, I, Carolyn, at Dharma Study Group, I shared a personal story. And that also made me a little bit vulnerable. Sarah Joy knows that because I was wiggling my toes and I got a little bit thirsty and my voice tone went up and my heart rate was pounding, but I was still talking in front of other people that I don't know that well to Sarah Joy, who's my teacher. And I did it. I kept talking and I stayed cohesive and I was clear-hearted. And appreciate yourself for all of that. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
Do you guys have a sense of affection for her right now? It's a big risk to tell the story, and you have a sense that they appreciate your willingness? So you can add that in. When I'm lying in bed, I shared a vulnerable thing in Dharma group tonight, and I did it with clarity and cohesiveness with people I don't know that well about something that I could have had a meltdown about. And I felt them appreciating me as well as Sarah Joy's appreciation. And if you really soak that in, it helps to transition the negativity bias to something that we can call the compassion bias. Do you follow what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. We so rarely remember to appreciate ourselves because that negativity bias is programmed to try to keep you safe. This is my recommended homework to the teachers who were in the training yesterday, and I'll recommend to the rest of you also that based on the researcher in Seattle, John Gottman, who has a place there called the Marriage Lab. Have you heard of it? You know it? Jimena, you know it? You also know it, right, Annie? So he researched and wrote up several books about this, and he said for a marriage to be successful, it needs 5 times the praises or appreciations as it has to the criticisms. So I will say, for your marriage to yourself, which is already, you are here, this is the one you're with, for that to be successful, 5 times the number of praises or appreciations as the number of criticisms. So if you're going to toss yourself a criticism, be prepared with 5 appreciations if you want the relationship to be successful. So how do you offer appreciation when you're experiencing a trial or a tribulation or a life event, like you just said, unrelenting life events where we're growing and taking risks to do things, and yet it can feel like a stormy ocean? Where do the appreciations come from?
Staying in it.
So you can appreciate yourself for staying in it. But what is the source of the voice of appreciation? How are you going to generate that? Yes?
I would say it usually comes actually from stepping out, and it's empathy that you would treat somebody better than you're treating yourself, usually. And I have, in rare circumstances, been able to pull myself back in that way, to be able to kind of step back and be kind to myself, because I'm usually more kind to others than myself.
Yes. This is very common, you know. Yes. People are more kind to others than they are to themselves.
To interrupt the...
Yes.
Sorry.
You have to interrupt it. No, exactly, that's it. You have to interrupt the criticism. In fact, what you could do is think of the criticism like the person who's driving too slow on the freeway, speaking as an East Coaster, or the person who is unskillfully merging on the freeway. What is the matter out here? I mean, really,
I get honked so much.
the driving.
It's not West Coast, it's Oregon.
But towards those people, my mantra is, thank you. Thank you for slowing me down. Thank you for reminding me to be a safe driver. Thank you for reminding me that there's context here right now. This is not just at my speed and my capacity, but we're all here together. So you could say to the criticism, oh, thank you. I am reminded to give myself 5 appreciations right now. Yes?
I have an image that's helpful for me, and that is from the movie Contact.
I don't
Remember
know
that
it.
movie Contact?
No.
I don't even remember much about it, except that there was one scene that had a picture of all the satellite dishes that are somewhere in Nevada or Utah.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And they're huge. I mean, they're massive because they're in the middle of the desert, and they are searching for extraterrestrial.
ETs.
And yeah, in the movie, and maybe this is me making it up since it's been a long time since I've seen it, but there's some point where there's a button pushed, and the satellite dish is able to like go to another galaxy. And to me, it has both that quality of huge shift, except it's happens with a button pushing, and it has both that surrender and effort at once of knowing that it's both at once,
Mm-hmm.
to make that shift in myself that
Yes.
feels so stuck and so, consuming,
Mm-hmm.
all pervasive, and
Mhm.
to be able to make that shift, it's at once just as much as turning my head,
Yeah.
and yet it's so profoundly different than what my cells want to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, and what our cells want to do, the primal programming, is related to our survival, right, as a species. So you have this cellular urge, and then you have this spiritual urge too, to grow and evolve and so on. So I like that image of the turning of the satellite thing. The experience of appreciation, interrupting the inner critic, and let's say finding that button that you can use, whether some people use it, they'll have a mindfulness bell like this, or a mindfulness moment, or you can go to a mindfulness tool like the air against the skin and so on. So if you catch the criticism when it's arising, you can say, oh, my brain state just responded to that criticism. If you can then say, let me regulate my brain state. By the time you offer the appreciations, you're going to soak them in, not reject them. The urge to reject them is the primitive brain saying, we can't handle appreciation right now because it's not going to keep us safe and alive since we're in danger. Danger, perceived danger. So if you can regulate your brain state in just a few breath cycles, and you can regulate it in a few breath cycles if you practice on a consistent basis, your neurological system will drop back to what you experienced when we had meditation earlier tonight. And if you practice consistently, it'll drop into an improved experience of what you were having tonight with the meditation, just in case you didn't have a great meditation. So you have a criticism, you say, oh, there's my bell, there's my poor driver reminding me. There's my button to push on the satellites. Regulate the brain, the breath, and then bring to mind 5 appreciations. 1, for the inner judge who's trying to keep you safe. Thank you so much for all the hard work you've offered me. Thank you so much for all the hard work that you do to keep me safe all the time. I know you have the best possible intentions, so you say thank you to the inner judge like this. Because there's an instinct that's trying to keep you safe, so appreciate that. Then you can appreciate your innocence and your earnestness, your vulnerability, and the 5th thing is your shared humanity. So this is mathematical. You start with appreciation for the inner judge. Then your innocence, your earnestness, the vulnerability that you are setting yourself into when you want to grow and evolve. And then an appreciation for the shared humanity that's you. Sometimes you can't get one of those to work, but you may find that frequently you're able to appreciate the humanity. Like when Julia was saying, it's easier to be kind to others than to be kind to yourself. You may find you have to start with shared humanity and then go back through your vulnerability, your earnestness, your innocence, and the inner judge. So I do recommend empathy towards the inner critic. I also recommend acknowledging just fundamentally that your inner critic probably has nothing new to say to you and doesn't actually have your growth and best interests at heart. Your inner critic probably has nothing new to say to you and does not actually have your best interest at heart. Best interest is you want to grow and evolve. Like you're saying, you're hitting these growth spurts. Well, I've known Annie for a long time, and I know she's a person committed to growth and to personal evolution, as well as to her in her family, her husband and her children. The inner critic doesn't have that as the best interest. Inner critic is keep this organism safe, restrain her or him. So if you remind yourself the inner critic has relatively nothing new to say and is not having your best interest at heart, but you still appreciate that the instinct for the inner critic was to keep you safe. Then you don't have to be angry at its lousy job performance. I suspect that people who are on a spiritual path, as you are in this room, you wouldn't tolerate being held back by your inner critic. But we don't know how to negotiate with it as skillfully as we might. So if you start appreciating it, 5 appreciations for the inner critic might go a long way too. This I'm just using John Gottman's mathematical equation there when I say that. Okay, any last questions? Does that seem like a somewhat helpful strategy for you to employ?
I feel like it might be hard to like realize that you are criticizing yourself sometimes.
Here's a way to know if you're being criticized by yourself. You have a physiological response to it. Do you know what your physiological responses are? Your personal ones?
Yeah.
So then if you go into your intellect and think, am I criticizing myself or not? It may be a waste of time if you go right to the body and say, am I being criticized by myself? Oh yeah, I am. Then you can try on doing something about it, but don't go too much into your head to think, is this a criticism? Am I supposed to follow Sarah Joy's suggestions now? You can't lose on following those suggestions anyway. Maybe you'll have a surplus of 5 appreciations on some days. So you might have to do this 10 or 12 times in the course of a day. Or more. But if one time you get it wrong and you weren't actually criticizing yourself, well, you got 5 free appreciations. That's good. Build your reservoir. You'll need it.
I think at some point my mom was doing that as like, when my sister and I were real little, like if we said something mean to each other, we then had to say 3 nice things to each other.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps that was your mom's intention. I think sometimes with little kids it's helpful to, there's other strategies too, but I don't have time to go into those strategies tonight. Like sometimes children are being mean to each other because there's 2 beings trying to have agency at once and they're colliding. And then you're forced to say something nice. It can be a little bit complicated, so I won't take that conversation up right now. But someday we can. So let's sit for a couple of minutes together quietly to finish for tonight. So, and you can lie down again if you need to, but being erect is really nice as a body reminder to condition the brain and the body for these moments of mindfulness. So invite your thinking mind to drop down from activity and conversation into feeling again, where your body makes contact with the ground. And know that contact very directly between the mat and the blanket, the ankles or shins. And as you bring your thinking mind into contact with the ground, know that you're using mindfulness to train a brain state that is less frightened and less likely to scan the environment for danger. You're soothing the organs in the brain that were programmed for primitive fear. To rest your thinking mind on the ground beneath you and assure the brain that at the moment you are safe and resourced and connected. And with appreciation for your efforts to be here tonight, you can bring the palms together in Anjali Mudra. And for all the efforts you made today in your vulnerable, earnest, and innocent life, offer yourself an appreciation. And with an exhalation, you may bow your head to your heart. And release your hands and open your eyes. And I thank you very much for being here this evening. And I often request, and I will again tonight, that we leave the Dharma study group in contemplative silence, so we're not getting into random conversation now. So that which you've internalized is precious and you can sustain it. Thank you, everyone. I look forward to seeing you again.